I'm going to talk about cybersecurity in the IoT and embedded world. And well, that's it. I'd like to start with this quote from a friend. It's this one: crypto without security is useless, and the reverse is also true. And what he means is that, well, information security, if we don't use cryptographic to protect the information, we only have an information system and management system that, well, of course, it is necessary nowadays for risk management and everything, but that's it. There's no more protection beside us. And the deposit is cryptography without an appropriate application, but this obviously is of no use. So I like this quote from this guy. So I'm going to start talking about the IoT, and I'm also going to talk about embedded devices and how can we protect them with information security, but also with some of cryptography that is available on these devices nowadays. I'm actually focusing only on two embedded families, and it's the ESP32, which is probably one of the most famously used around the world, and about the NXP family, this user ARM embedded device. So I'm going to start with the IoT. Well, this classification here for the mini IoT, there are many vertical strategies on the Internet of Things. We can say, for example, consumer IoT, which is already the most exposed and the one who brings a lot of money because you sell a lot, many people, and well, you just mass produce it, and you have a lot of applications now there that can be webcams, light bulbs, etc. There is also the commercial IoT, which is a mixture between consumer devices, and we have the industrial IoT, the IIoT, which is, of course, one of the main factors that is working on now the Industry 4.0, what we call this. So the IoT infrastructure together with internet connection, some people say the 5G internet, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and it mixes everything, and we have the IIoT. And that's it. Those are the main classifications that I like to mention about the IoT. Now, the problem with IoT is that in the security circles, we used to joke about the S on IoT, it's about security. Well, there's no S on IoT, so that's the joke. But from a security point of view, the IoT, well, of course, this belief that these devices are inherently insecure because they have so many weaknesses, because there are sometimes cheap products that they are sold in bulk. But because this popularity and this massive development, they're distributed with some, I would say, easy to use configurations, because then you have your device and you have no knowledge about technology, but you would like to have some technology at home or at your office, and you just buy some webcam or device, whatever device you would like to use. And there's the thing, you basically, actually it's on the next slide, you have something like this, you have a webcam, and there's a small pinhole in the back, and then you take whatever Android phone, iOS, or whatever, you just approach it, and maybe, I don't know if it can be seen, but there's also a QR code here. Oh, it's just failing, hold on. So there's a QR code here that, well, you can scan with your cell phone, and there's probably an application in the iOS store and Apple Store, Google Play Store, or whatever, and you just press this button here, and sometimes that's it. You install the application, press this button, and this webcam is already broadcasting to your cell phone. But it's not only broadcasting to your cell phone, it's broadcasting everywhere. But this is just an example that you may already have heard about. But there are many other kind of devices that have this facility. So the end user doesn't have to think much about what to do to start working or having fun, even sometimes fun, about the device. So that's the idea. So people, I mean, the masses can just work with these devices with no problem at all. But then again, we have problems that, well, since they're way too easy to configure, sometimes they have some configurations that are also easier to hack for many adversaries or people around the world. Besides that, well, these devices are usually connected to the internet. You just probably want to connect it to your Wi-Fi network, but you sometimes you didn't have to type in your password, just the cell phone. I mean, the application send it, broadcast it some way that this device get the information and connects. And not only it's available in your computer, I mean in your local network, in the home, it's available to everybody. And we have seen many cases about these baby monitors that you just put beside your child, your baby, and just to check out if he or she is fine. And sometimes there are web pages where you just browse them. And I read stories about people, I mean, connecting to the cameras and speaking to the baby from, I don't know, whatever place on the internet. So it's very dangerous. This privacy situation is quite it's quite a problem for these devices. But again, then they're very easy to use. You just turn it on, plug in, and just push a button sometimes, and that's it. We can recall from 2016 this very famous malware. This is the Mirai malware. I don't know if any of you recall them, but this Mirai malware attacked a lot of IoT devices. This just connect them and install some malware. And at the end, they start to make a network for attacking servers. In this case, they particularly attacked the DNS server, which is a DNS. Well, actually, I'm a user from that service. Now I think it's probably owned by Oracle. I think they buy it, I think after sometime after this attack. So it was about 1 terabyte per second of internet traffic. It was probably too much for the DNS servers, and well, it collapsed. The thing is that many big guys on the internet use this service for the DNS, like Netflix and some other device. I mean, other companies. So it was quite a big deal by the time. And one interesting thing about it is probably if you guys are into programming, you may know that sometimes making a program for a different platform pretty complicated. Nowadays on embedded workers, there are Arduino IDE, then you just plug in your embedded board, and that's it. You compile, and the code goes there. The machine code is compiled for that device. But for example, let's say you have a Windows machine, and you would like to program or make an iOS program. Then you basically you can't, because there's some compatibility issues. Because the Windows machine has an architecture, and it can't produce directly the code for that. So you have to install several programs. But in particular case of the iOS, then you have some licensing problems, and you can compile them. If you go for an OS X computer, well, you can compile to Android because you have the licenses, and you can compile for iOS because, well, it's, of course, it's the same family. But the thing is that what you have to do is cross-compile. Now the programs, I mean, the IDE, they do it for you, but in the beginning, this is complicated. In the case of the IoT, well, it's also a different platform, but this guy, the one that made the Mirai malware, they made something really funny. They uploaded the source code to every single, well, not all, but most of them, but several at least, of the IoT devices, and they compile the malware inside. So what they have, they skipped the difficulty of cross-compiling by compiling on the device itself. So, well, it was quite nice. They do that because that way, I think it was Symantec, which is, I think now, well, Symantec has some issues as a company. It was bought by Akamai, I think, the Akamai caching service. But before that, was Semantic was famous because they got a copy. I believe they were there. We got a copy of the Mirai malware, and well, it was just because they compiled it in the device. So but it was nice. So we have now copies of the Mirai. And unfortunately, since we have the source code, there are many variants of the Mirai malware around the world. I mean, there's still some Mirai malware still there out there that well, some variants at least, which also produces something new. You know, you may have heard about infrastructure as a service and platforms as a service. But now we have malware as a service. What is this? Well, in case you haven't heard about, well, now you have a malware and you can create botnets. Now you can subscribe to a service, a malware service in this case, where you pay a monthly fee and you launch botnets. In this case, for malware and ransomware. And if they pay you, well, you earn some money, and you have to be paying your monthly payment. But that's one of these things, nasty things. But it produces now from a computing point of view, it's interesting, but of course, well, it's a complete disaster from the security part. Because now they don't even need to know many information technology at all. They just have to pay, and that's kind of bad. Um, this graphic, well, I like to present. These are old. I mean, it's 2017, but I like to point out, well, because well, I'm from Mexico, and we were in the top three countries which were attacked by the Mirai malware. You can actually download a sample code of the Mirai source code from this GitHub, but of course it's dangerous because it's actually malware. Actually, if you download it, this is quite change that your antivirus in your computer, if you're using Windows and have an antivirus, this probably will detect it as a malware, and maybe you will have issues trying to download it because obviously it detects it as a malware because it's actually the source code of the malware. But it's not in all the cases. You can have a try it, but just be conscious that this could be illegal in many countries. Now, what can we do in this case? Well, to have an adequate security level in our infrastructure, well, of course, we will need some security practices. You may already know about the basic services of security, which is, well, one of them, the basic is confidentiality. Confidentiality. So you have to hide your information, so protect that no one can read your private information. The other classic security service, it's integrity, which of course talks about the data is not modified by someone who should not be modifying your information. These two ones, integrity and confidentiality, well, they can be served with cryptography. So we can use some cryptographic scheme to protect the information that no one's going to read it, no one else, no one intended could read your information. And the integrity, well, we can detect when there is a modification. And the third basic system is availability. For this, we require some information technology for management and providing the services and being sure that it's always available, your information. These are the three basic services that you may already know. But nowadays, we are having a new trend for non-repudiation and also for authentication, which are, well, they always been one of this information security service, but it's now this day that since information technology and the security is changing, well, is now one of the required service. One of two, they're already being pushed into the information security environment. So non-repudiation is basically provide some way to prove that you generate a document or some information or a message, but also that you can say you didn't created that document. So this is particularly useful for contracts. When you create a contract in digital world, of course, you would like that no one well, no one modifies their contract, of course, but if you created that contract, then you are legally bound to this contract and you have to work on whatever you say you were going to do in this contract. So this also gives some peace of mind to both parties, not only you, but also to the receiving part, because then this way you share your information, and the information, it wasn't created by someone else trying to impersonate you. And of course, the authentication, which has been a trend in the last couple of years, since we have this, it's not a fancy, but the two-factor authentication. Now that we know some group of hackers can hack into the text messages system, and then we need something else to protect our information. In this case, our credentials, because passwords are no longer enough now. So we have to use some authentication schemes, and well, two-factor authentication is probably one of the trends that's going to stay with, well, basically forever, or I don't know. Now, talking about more of the things that need to be protected, you may have heard about the OWASP project. The OWASP project usually focus on web services and the top 10 web insecurities or 10 bad practices that create problems on web. But the OWASP also has created one project for the Internet of Things. There's a top 10 OWASP for IoT. It was originally released in 2014. It's actually before the Mirai malware. Now in 2018, they have released a second installment, a revised one, probably including some of the things they detected or new trends with the Mirai malware. So obviously it's only 4 years. We expect in 2022 or probably up to 2024 some small modifications for the IoT, but it will depend on other things that need to be fixed before making some new recommendation. So actually I have yes, I have the top 10 here, and these are the 10, well, the top 10 OWASP for IoT. So the first one is, of course, the one we're talking about just a couple minutes ago. It's the weak, guessable, or hard-coded passwords. So this is a problem for IoT. This also is a problem for many other devices. But in particular, in IoT, well, these are disposable devices in many cases because they're cheap and bundled in mass. So sometimes they just make some weak password there that you just print in the back, which is nice because then you can configure it easier. But then there's no way to change it because this is actually the same password for everybody. So when we have this situation, we have a massive amount of devices with exactly the same password. So there's a big problem for the IoT. The second top 10 will be insecure network services. These devices, well, of course, they try to connect whatever means possible. So they probably won't be using the safest procedures or the safest practices to connect the network. As I said before, sometimes you just approach your cell phone and then magically it's connected to the internet, this device, which is fine from a consumer point of view, but from a privacy point of view, then it's a problem because I don't know how, why, but it's already connected and how, and everybody can connect itself. So the same, well, the top 3 will be insecure ecosystem interfaces, but it's related to these insecure network services because there's a few interfaces to connect. There's an old app is still around that everybody connects, and the information goes. For example, you have some device with sensor network, and you are uploading your information every, I don't know, every 5 seconds, every 5 minutes. But it goes to the internet and some service just like that, and it could be some private information or information that you wouldn't be thinking you will be sharing, but it's actually, well, you're not precisely sharing with everybody, but it goes there just like that without any kind of protection. Another thing they have in problem, of course, is a security update mechanism. There is usually no way to update in a secure way these devices. Well, of course, some companies they release their updates, but then you have to download and then download it. Or sometimes you just press a button and it just update, but there's no usually a lot of support for many years. You just expect to have this device a couple of years, and after that, then it's gone. And besides that, well, we have outdated components because since the company wasn't expecting you to have this device for long enough time, they won't be updating the software, the firmware, in case they detect some, I don't know, some vulnerability in the components. They probably won't fix it because they will say, oh, well, the internal battery won't last that long, so just drop it. But sometimes these devices are still being used, and there's no way to update it because they have really outdated components, and you can just update it. But we talk about this, and number 6, privacy protection, is usually insufficient. I mean, you can understand if you don't want to share everything about the device, well, you either have everything shared or you don't have anything shared. So that's the problem. The same, well, data transfer or storage. If you have one device that is capturing images and you take pictures, it's stored there, but it's also being transmitted somewhere else, and you have no control about that. Usually, but it's not always the case, of course, that's why it's so below in the list, it's the lack of device management. You can have, for example, if you buy, I don't know, maybe a few webcams of the same brand, same model, of course, you can download the application and you have all the screen cameras in your cell phone. But that's it, if you buy something else, but usually they can talk to each other and there's no way to control them. Which is also a problem if you have a large company and will add a certification like the ISO 27000, well, of course, you can't do anything about it. The default settings, of course, they're usually insecure because they're meant to be easier to configure, and this is linked to top number 1. And well, of course, there's a lack of physical hardware in most of these devices because the idea, well, is to have access to the device. But also we have here some problem because if we have physical access to the device, well, of course, there are many security proof that we have already defined that no longer applies because we have physical access to the device. And in case of the IoT, well, it's even critical because you can just reset the device and take control of it like in no time. So I think it's important to have in mind these top 10 of what's for IoT because they're the main problems there's in this ecosystem and that we need to fix somehow. How can we fix this? For example, let me go back. Sorry. How can I fix this device, for example, to make it easier, simpler to use, but also having it private? So that's the challenge that many of these companies have. But of course, many of them they just don't do anything because it will complicate things a lot, and well, eventually they will lose some market share. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about embedded devices. Similarly, well, there's no top 10 awards for embedded devices, but it's related to IoT. But in case of embedded devices, of course, it's much more complex devices. In the case of the IoT, the platform is usually this processor ARC, which is nice. It has enough power, computing power, to do whatever they have to do. Could be just a sensor, could be just I don't know, some light bulbs, or there are many stuff they can. But in case of embedded device, well, it's a much more complex device, and of course, it has its own challenges. In particular, this list will contain some of the common that has to be addressed somehow. For example, not all of the embedded boards have a secure boot. When I mean a secure boot, it's just like Windows that you start and they have some signatures and certificates for protection. This is the same case for the embedded devices. In the case of the embedded devices, well, you start a device, but how do you know if someone else have tampered it? Well, there is no way. So some embedded devices or some embedded board has secured with protection, but most of them they don't have. Even though those who have, they have as an option. So you buy, for example, a very expensive NXP board, and you see that this secure boot is an option, and then you have to buy one that is much more expensive, and then you realize you have to buy 100 of them, and then well, the numbers don't match up because you won't have enough budget to buy all of them with the secure goods because it's still quite expensive. Now we also have the same issue here about secure code updates. Not all of them have firmware updates, and but there's a problem in some of these devices, especially when you have an embedded device. You usually have it located in positions where they're quite cumbersome to access them. For example, if you have a novel in the industry and you have to climb, I don't know, 40 meters to the ceiling to change on a bed device, of course it's going to be a problem to update this device. If you have a car, then you have to go inside the car, and these boards they're just there, but you can't update it because you have to take it out, and sometimes you have to take out the engine and some more stuff. So it's complicated for some of these. Of course, there is some board that has access and special access for them, but it will vary on the device. Regarding that security, they don't all have proper security. Actually, the couple boards I'm showing here, they do actually have some that security, but people tend not to use them until recently, like 1 or 2 years ago, when they started taking care of these embedded devices from a cybersecurity point of view. And now they all want to do cryptography on these devices, but they haven't doing that before. And the manufacturer, they include the technology for data security or data protection, but it's not being done. And well, extensively in many cases. They have the problem of authentication. You know, when you have a remote sensor network, where you have the issue that there's a new device to the group, and then how you know this device is actually for the company and not from some other adversary who is trying to connect to your network and trying to do weird stuff with your devices, and but there's a complete problem. Now we have at least, I mean, a requirement for secure communication. You may know that some of these embedded boards, they have some kind of connection. Of course, I mean, modern ones, they have Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, even Bluetooth low energy, and even LoRa at some point. But most of the time, you would like to have a small embedded device just connected with a cable in a CAN network or something like that. And it's just a wire that anybody can just wire tap it, and so sometimes it's not possible to protect that kind of communication. Of course, there is now protection for that, but you have to write it down and prepare that stuff, and you may or may not have enough storage area for that part. Now, embedded devices also need protection against cyber attacks. And you may recall in the past few years that there was this weird attack on the Chevrolet cars. These Chevrolet cars, it's in the States. I don't have connection here. I don't even have a Chevrolet car, but they just connect. No, it wasn't Chevrolet. It was Jeep car, and they have this internet connection where you can use. Well, essentially they have the maps in the device, you know, the navigation map in the car, and sometimes you pay a subscription, and the navigation system will give you information about the traffic. Of course, you can use Waze, you can use Google Maps, Apple Maps, or Open Maps, or whatever maps. But well, inside the car, if you pay for the navigation system, but you also have to pay for a subscription, and you have some information quite interesting. For example, Um, uh, I visited once with my car to the United States. I do have a navigation system in my car, but I don't have the subscription because it's not available subscription in Mexico. But I crossed the United States by car, and then the map was showing me the exact position of the parking lots, and I was like, but we don't have that in Mexico. So it was interesting to see that, and we'll have even more interesting to see if there's some extra information available, but probably it won't be connected. The thing is that these cars, the Jeeps, they have some internet connection. Essentially, you can call your car in case of some, I mean, it's deposit. Your car can call your agency in case of an accident. The thing is that you can also connect to your car. And in these attacks, they just connected to the car next to him and activated the emergency brakes. And of course, well, the car derailed from the road. But they also did that connection without accessing, I mean, the brakes remotely. So these devices, I mean, these embedded devices, which were connected in the case of in the car, were receiving a cyber attack. And there was some other very famous attacks. I recall it was this conference Eurocreep in 2009, I think. They opened but they didn't have a proper card. They just had the door and the system for the door, and they proved it right there in the conference. They just they launched an attack and unlocked the door, and well, it was open without using the card keys. Unfortunately, this same attack also worked with the Tesla in 2000. I think it was somewhere between 2016 and 2018. I don't recall exactly. They did exactly the same attack. Well, of course, they have now done it with a proper car, and they simulated an attack. Of course, I mean, they have their car parked somewhere, and they were with an RFID and some more antennas. They were collecting the information as they launched an attack. It was exactly the same attack because they were using the same encryption technology. And unfortunately, later on in 2020, I think, they did a similar attack again with the Tesla. And so we see that companies, they aren't really investing enough in protection of cyber attacks for this kind of embedded devices. And unfortunately, well, these Tesla cars, they're quite expensive, and they don't even have this kind of protection, which is a shame because you pay a lot of money. I don't know how much Tesla costs in India, but here in Mexico, it's even much more expensive than BMW, much more than, I would say, 3 times regular car, maybe 4 times. So it's, well, they don't invest. Now, another security requirement for these embedded devices would be intrusion detection and security monitoring. Of course, they don't have encryption, they won't have intrusion detection at all. If we have a network sensor, when we can try to connect in and try to do some monitoring, but of course, this monitoring will require a lot of energy, which could be pretty deep in some environments. Same for security management, because, well, we need more technology, more infrastructure and battery. Well, I mean energy to manage them. And we have also device tampering detection in some high-end embedded devices, but it's not in all of them. So all these are the main security requirements for these devices that we need to address in the following weeks, but I would say in the next few years. I mean, we don't have to wait a lot of time. We need this right now. Let's talk now about the ESP32. You may know about it. And well, after initial success of the ESP8266, which is a small, but well, it's a small board, but quite useful. Actually, well, I do have a picture of the ESP8266 here, and I labeled it as ESP32, but it is the 8266, but well, whatever. Well, it's a family. Well, after initial success, well, they launched the ESP32, which is widely used, and many platforms and many companies just have developed similar boards with the same chipset, just with different features. They added, for example, they added the screen, they added Bluetooth, or they removed something else, and that's it. This ESP32 contains a Tensilica Extensa LX6 microprocessor. Tensilica, well, it was bought and is now part of Cadence Design System. But I would say just for now, because someone will buy it. I mean, it's quite a good device. This processor or microprocessor, well, it does have DSP-oriented features, but essentially it's a general purpose, well, more like general purpose processor, because it does support 8-way SIMD operation. That's it. All of the normal, the normal operation we have in modern processors. It has wide SIMD registers, and of course, well, it has a large memory bandwidth, which is quite nice because the memory wall will be less restrictive for this kind of this particular brand of devices. This is the one. I think this, yes, it's probably, well, I can read what it says here, but I suppose you can either. But it's probably an 8266, and it just, if you can see, well, there's the climate here. It was well, it was temporary. It's 10 Celsius. I mean, anyway. So the ESP32 room, which is not this one, well, it does have Wi-Fi, Bluetooth low energy. It's an MCU model, microprocessor center unit, but it does have 2 CPU cores. So it has the same amount of CPU cores as my current laptop, which I'm broadcasting right now. But well, of course, they only run at up to 240 megahertz, which is a lot. Interestingly, this device has a pipeline of 7 stages, which means that it is possible to accommodate instructions and to have the execution of 7 instructions at the same time. If, well, of course, we need to do the programming, the appropriate programming to use these 7 stages, but there's an option to have 7 stages per learning, which is quite that, and it's quite a lot actually. 7 stages is well, it's a lot, and you can do a lot of stuff with that. Now, this is the diagram. I think I downloaded from Wikipedia. This is the expressive ESP32, and well, it's a bit small. I'm going to change the color. This one's fine. You can see here, or maybe not, this section here. What is the diagram? I mean, of course, it's not just not like that, but it's the cryptographic hardware acceleration. Just like the Intel computers, we have hardware acceleration. We have in the ESP32 some hardware acceleration. This is, we have instructions to do cryptography. Of course, using these instructions in an embedded device, but it's quite different as we do usually in a normal computer. As you may know, in an embedded devices, we have to set the flags for the interruptions and wait until the microcontroller is done with whatever it is doing, and it would probably just launch another signal. It will be just looping around forever until it changes some flag, and then we just clear the instruction. Just like we used to do programming in the past when we have to do interruptions in DOS, just exactly the same. Well, we have to do this well, quite similarly, and for this embedded device. In the case of this cryptographic hardware acceleration, well, there's some instructions and some flags we have to set in some register. The nice thing is they're named registers, so we just call them by the name in our C program, and it will start doing whatever we requested, and it will advise us. Interesting, well, it of course has the AES encryption system, which is the standard. It's the standard right now for encryption of documents of general purpose. It does have a SHA function, which is a digital signature. Well, not a signature. Um, it's a digital digest of some message. So you have some message, we apply the hash function, and we have an universal identifier for those messages. And we also have a random number generator. Well, of course, all the embedded devices have already now a random number generator. The good thing about it is this one connects to the DAC, the digital to analog converter, and the other one is the ADC, the analog to digital converter. So they just sensing the surroundings, the electricity, some electronic noise or whatever is there. Just says it. I use it as an input. Well, you have to use that with a serial random number generator. So they just call this connected. Interestingly, they do have the RSA encryption algorithm, which is still being used now for electronic commerce. I mean, right now we are using something different for electronic commerce, but the RSA is still being used. The nice thing about it is the RSA requires wide words in the processor, which means this device has support for operations with a larger than a word size, which means that we can use it for something else. Of course, this is bounded to, in this particular case, this model, the ESP32 is bounded to RSA of 1024. So we can have up to 2048 bits numbers in this with this device, but that's another story for the following section. Well, we have this stuff. But the thing is that that's it. We don't have secure boot. We don't have hardware tampering. And of course, we don't have a secure area to store our cryptographic credentials. Everything has to be done in the regular memory. But anyway, we have some cryptographic operations here. We can be used for protection of the information protection. Now, I'm going to talk about the NXP. I'm talking about NXP because here in my current city, they do have support for this device. It's actually the company in this brand. That's what I know it. So the NXPs is some Kinetis microcontrollers, MCUs. They're multiple hardware software compatible. I mean, they're essentially ARM Cortex M0 Plus or M4 based MCU devices. They actually bought some company like, well, I don't recall the name of the company, but now they have this line Coldfire and they have the Kinetis. The Coldfire has a cow. Oops. Hello. As a cow, this is a cryptographic acceleration unit. That's it. There's a software library which has access to these low-level cryptographic functions, as opposed to the ESP, where you have to access directly with the registers. So the NXP has some software library for that. In the case of the Kinetic, well, we have the MMCOW, it's memory mapped cryptographic unit, which is similar, but it's more similar to the ESP than to the original COW. So this is, in this case, is for the M4 devices. This is a picture of the Freedom, FDRM K64F, which is one of the top of the line Freedom line. Now from the Freedom line is one of the top of the line models. It runs at 120 megahertz, and what is essentially an M4, which is one of the big devices. One interesting thing is that it has a floating point unit, which is usually very bad in most of the small devices. And well, it may have a Bluetooth module. That's a picture. I think it's not very good picture because they sent me this picture from one of my devices from the lab. Now we have this diagram. Of course, this diagram You can read it because I don't even can read it properly because it was from the NXP webpage and was the one that was available. So I'm sorry about it. Now you can see, well, here's the Cortex M4, and there's some information around some of the devices. But here we have the security and integrity part of the device. But it announces they have CRT support, which is useless now. It's only being used in the TCP IP layer just for error correction, but it's useless. I mean, it will say you, oh, there's a mistake, or maybe it won't detect it. Then there's the CAU, the cryptographic acceleration unit, and the random number generator. Of course, next to it, there's the analog converters. But I don't know, well, there's an optional feature here, is the hardware tamper detection unit. So the NXP does have support for tamper detection, but it's an optional feature. You have to pay a bit more for your board to have this tamper detection unit. So it's a different model probably that I don't currently have. But they do have the option for this. Now, what are the capabilities of the device using an IoT? Well, here's a list of the capabilities. I mean, we have these two guys, they're very famous. They're Arduino Nano 33 IoT and the BLE version, which are some of the new Arduino devices. They're in that good, as I understand. I haven't tested, just I have heard from some friends. The Nano 33 IoT, it has a ARM Cortex M0 Plus, which have 32 kilobytes of RAM, which is quite small, and a clock speed of 48 megahertz. It's low, but it's fine. The thing is, the RAM is quite small. Now we have the BLE, which is an M4, which is obviously quite bigger, and well, it has 1 megabyte of ROM and a quarter of RAM. Then we have a lot of stuff we can do now, but it's only 64 megahertz, which isn't that bad. We have another famous one, the Piranha. That's a MIPS 32. It has a fairly decent amount of memory and goes up to 120 megahertz. The TNC 3.2 is an M4, and again, up to 120. And the ESP32's room, which is the one we have talked about, has a lot of memory and up to 240 megahertz. I mean, you can actually do quite a lot of stuff with it. You can, as I understand, you can even connect some external device and do fancy stuff. And I don't know, this one is the Hi-Fi one. There's a RISC-V processor, which is the hot architecture these days. Has a good, very good amount of RAM and an impressive, quite impressive megahertz. Well, you know, you might have heard about the RISC-V architecture, which is open source, and we hope they do some battle against the ARM devices, because they're eating all the market already. So now let's talk about cryptography. We're getting close to an hour, so we still have time. So as I mentioned before, the AES is a standard for cryptography. So it was published, the standard, in 2001, well, February 26, 2001. It was published by the NIST in the state because that's the standard for the United States. But, well, you know, everybody wants to do some business with them, so everybody just adopted this one. They just made the variation of this standard. So this standard, well, it's actually in the FIPS 197, and it's essentially this kind of structure. There's the diffusion, and we call this the whole thing as, well, by substitution, the confusion. Any cryptographic algorithm or encryption system should have these two guys. There's some part of confusion, which, as the name said, well, it's trying just mix all the stuff to confuse the people. I mean, And the diffusion parts distributes the affected bits throughout all the place. In this case, the AES standard, um, it contains this structure, but you can probably, I don't know if you can read here, it's a round one. Oops, round one. So you have to do for the AES 128, you have to do 10 rounds. For the AES 192, you have to do 12 rounds. And the AES 256, you have to do 14 rounds. So essentially, you have a key, a cryptographic key of 128, 192, and 256. Well, one of the three. You choose the size, and you do some transformations. You do 10 transformation, 12 transformation, or 14 transformation of the keys. Obviously, it depends on the size. The more rounds you have to do, and you mix your key with all your data. This plain text is fixed at 128 bits, and then you mix it with your key of usually 128, 192, or 256, doesn't matter, and repeat the process depending on the key size. This number of rounds, of course, is linked to the size of the key because you have to mix all your keys bits with your plain text. Now, if you have more than 128 bits, you have to repeat this procedure with the next 128 bits, but you have to mix up the stuff, like some feedback from your previous result, you mix it with the next one, or you mix the keys before applying this, and well, there's some things called modus operation. But essentially, this is the AES, at least for 128 bits, it works just like that. And to decrypt, you have to do this algorithm in the opposite direction. And well, of course, if you did in reverse, you will reach from the ciphertext, you will reach the plain text. But you either program that, or as I mentioned before, you use the cryptographic hardware acceleration from the ESP32, the NXP, or you have a desktop computer, the Intel AMD. They all have this support. But you can just download a library. Now, in the case of Intel, which I just mentioned, AES, well, of course, has some consideration for the implementation and included some 6 new instructions, starting with the Westmere family of processors. That's, I think, is the second generation, and they call it AES new instruction, AES-NY, AES-NI, or whatever you want to call it. But the processor has instructions for executing the AES. And these are the instructions: AES encryption, AES encrypt last round, AES decryption, AES decryption for last round, and this is the message encoding and key generation assistance. So these are essentially instructions. You don't call it directly this way because, well, it's a computer, so you have software. You have some software who call these instructions, or the software implements them themselves because, well, desktop processor, they are quite large, so they don't need hardware support, but there's hardware support if you want. Of course, this hardware support is not available in all of the CPUs. I mentioned before that it started being available in the Westmere family processor, but only in the top of the line models. So the Core i3, for example, from the old family didn't have this feature. Currently, the current Intel generation, the Core i3 models, they do have the AES-NI support, but not on the older models. So if you have at least 5 to 6 years old computer, which is a Core i3, it's quite likely it doesn't have the AES-NI support. But if this is a new Core i3, it may have the AES-NI. Of course, Core i5 does have support, Core i7, Core i9 they do have, and the extreme versions. In the case of AMD, they are more flexible. They probably all all of them already they do have ASD, but I don't have an AMD right now, so I can tell. Now to execute in assembler, of course, the encryption, you have to do this. For the AES at 128 encryption, you have to do 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 rounds, and the last round, that's 10 rounds. So because it's an AES 128, and for the decryption, you have to do it in reverse. So you start here from what is 1, 2, then 3. So you start from the 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5. In reverse. So you just have to write down your keys. But that's only if you want to do it in assembler. In the case of Intel, well, there is also the intrinsics that you may have here in the intrinsics, which are just a macro for calling these instructions at once. Of course, there's an easier way. As I mentioned, you can use OpenSSL library, Microsoft Cryptographic API, next generation, they do have support for AES. And of course, you can use directly in GCC if you have it, or Intel CC++, Microsoft Visual C++, and quite likely in Clang, there's also support. I haven't checked in Clang, but of course, it should have support for AES. It's no big deal. In the case of the ESP32, which is one of the embedded boards, well, of course, it has an AES acceleration, as I showed in the diagram. It supports 128, 192, and 256 bits, and provides interfaces for encryption and decryption, but for the specific key length. So you have different instructions for different key lengths. So, for example, in the case of you would like to use the AES instructions directly from the ESP32 device, you have to do something like that. You have to initialize the AES mode. You put the number of bits you would like to work on, and the key in a number of registers. This N is start from 0 to whatever number you need for your 128, 192, and 256 bits. We're calling that they are 32 bits register. And the same for the text you would like to encode. In this case, it's obviously only 128, so in this case, it's only 4 of them. And you also have to define if you're using Little Indian, Big Indian, and well, it has some mixture for the words. It's a mess. They made a mess with the Indianness of the numbers. Then you have to write 1 to the AES start rec, so it will start the encryption process. And you have to wait, you have to be monitoring AES idle rec for it to be set to 1 when it's done. Once it's done, then you read the results, and that's it. You have encrypted a message with AES using this key. Of course, if you want to encrypt more blocks, well, you just load it again and again and again. In this case, it will use CBC mode of operation. Well, I didn't mention, but this is just a feedback. In the case of NXP, they have again 128, 192, and 256 bits. Unfortunately, it also supports these two guys who are deprecated, DES standard, which is the previous one, and the triple DES, which is a 3 times slower version of DES, but that is safer than DES. Obviously, it's less effective than AES, so, well, anyway, don't use DES or triple DES. Use just these 3 guys. Whatever you need, well, use these ones. And that's it, well, their support. In the case of hash function, well, you may know that a hash function is a digits function. This you have your block of n bits, whatever number of bits you have, and the hash function outputs a fixed number of bits, and that's due to digest and can be used as an identifier for this message in particular. Whatever message you have, what will be the identifier, and should be unique, fairly enough, depending on the size, on the hard function, will be enough. In the case of the ESP32, we have support for SHA-1, which is deprecated, and these three guys, SHA-256, 384, and 512, they are essentially SHA-2, the second version of the standard, but with different support. But this SHA-2 should not be used, should be slowly be replaced by the now SHA-3 standard, which is not supported, obviously, on the ESP32 because this model, well, it has some years now. In the case of NXP, it's even worse. It supports MD5, which is totally broken and trivially to do whatever you want, and SHA-1, which is also deprecated, and it only supports SHA-256, which is fine. But having this available may make people think that they can be used. Well, of course, they can be used, but they should not be used. Anyway, well, devices now have several sources connected to a single random number generator. They use them as input. In the case of ESP32, provides an RSI accelerator, as I mentioned before, which is a die-in technology for e-commerce. I'm not sure how long it will die, but it's a die-in technology. The NXP, well, it does contain a secure enclave, we call it that way, which is like a black box for cryptographic operation. Also, as I mentioned before, you may need to pay much larger model, but it does have that part. So you can trust your NXP, you can upload your keys to the secure enclave, and then your cryptographic keys, they're safe. Well, so what can we do now with this thing? Well, we can do message authentication, which a message authentication protocol, well, ensures that your information that you received, well, it was generated in a secure way and wasn't modified. Not only was encrypted, but you are sure it wasn't modified. So what we do now is to apply some encryption scheme and do this kind of modus operation, which results in a tag, a T tag. So you have a message of, I don't know, 1 gigabyte of information. You generate a tag, which is 128 bits, just like the hash function, but this one is encrypted, which is better from some scenarios. So this way you are sure that this hash was created by you. Because if you generate a hash function, the digits of using a hash function, well, anyone can generate that information. But since this one is encrypted using a key, then you are sure you're the only one who generates that identifier. So it's like a stronger version of the hash function. Now you can use the CVC map using encryption, but you can also use hash function, which I just criticized a few seconds ago, to construct a message authentication protocol, but adding just a key. You just have here a key, you do the hash of the key, and include that key in all your information. So if you do have the key, then you can validate this HMAC function, this tag, which is created at the end, and no one else could have created it. Of course, if you want to share this tag with someone else, the other part should have the key. But anyway, you know that any of you two guys, A and B parties, have the key, and any of you two guys will have generated the HMAC or the CVC MAC. So it's fine. Message authentication works that way. Now, a more complex protocol, it's called authenticated encryption. In the case of authenticated encryption, it's quite similar to the MAC, which outputs just a tag, just like an ID. You also have a key. You have a cryptographic key. You have cryptographic key. You have, in this case, you have a random. Actually, it's called unknowns. And here, you have some information about what is inside. What is inside of your message. So you have your information. You want to have authenticated encryption. Okay, well, you encrypt your information, and then you make this tag with this operation. You, of course, have some encryption. That's an encryption. There's some, well, there's actually a hash here, but it's only used once. And that about the information. So you can have this information and say, okay, the one generating this authenticated encryption tag ID is Luis. So the other party will know, oh, it's Luis. I would use the key corresponding to Luis and to verify this information. And that's how it works. And it's one of the current trends in cryptography, because authentication encryption could be used just simple box what you already have in your embedded devices, and then it will be quite simple to implement. Well, of course, you can download software who already implements this authenticated encryption and forget about it, but well, now you know there is some modules on your embedded board that can be used for that. Talking about cryptography and embedded boards, it's my former PhD supervisor, Mike Scott. In 2020, he implemented several cryptographic schemes, in particular, actually current generation encryption. And he tried the ESP32 board, and what is in seconds? It took 0.075 seconds to process one operation from this elliptic curve, which is used for, could be for connection or could be for signature, whatever. But you see, this board is 240 megahertz, and it took 0.075. This RISC-V processor, the one that I mentioned that I didn't have time to work on, which is 320 megahertz, well, it takes the double, but because it's a different architecture. And we have the M0, which is the cheap version of our ARM devices. Well, took a lot of time, 1.3 seconds. Then for 0.17 seconds. And the MIPS 32, which is what is low, well, it wasn't that bad, it was 0.197 seconds to do this operation. Now, if we use the optimized protocol, well, we have even better timings. Actually, in this case, the RISC-V processor, look, it matches almost the ESP32, despite being the double of this old technology here used for encryption. So in this case, this is the new technology being used in TLS connection on websites, which essentially is used for e-commerce. So essentially, you can add quite a strong security layer, I mean, a strong cryptography layer to these devices, and you can see this timings, they're less than a second, they're milliseconds, but this is still fine. It's just one embedded device that will be processing this stuff. Well, it's fairly fine. Of course, a server should have much more processing power and should do this sort of stuff in less time. But I mean, for an embedded device which is only focusing on one client, then it's fairly good enough, I would say. So essentially, there shouldn't be an excuse to implement cryptography on these embedded devices. There's an easier way, as I mentioned. There's the Embed TLS. The Embed OS is a real-time operating system for IoT. It's from ARM, but well, it's now part of Trusted Firmware, which is nice. They sell it, and I mean they give away for this open company. Now it contains two security-specific embedded building blocks: the ARM Embed TLS and the Secure Partition Manager. Of course, you need to have some hardware to make use of the Secure Partition Manager. Anyway, so this is an operating system, but you can only install the ARM Embed TLS library. And this library will detect if you have a cryptographic hardware accelerator, if you have secure enclave, or whatever other thing you have on your embed board, and you can just compile it from your board and then use the libraries that are there and then load it to your embed board. What does it have, the embed TLS? Well, it has, of course, TCP IP communication function, TLS communication functions, certificates, X.509 functions, which are the TLS certificates. Of course, has random number generator, but you might already have it, hatching, encryption, and decryption. Unfortunately, for the embed TLS, it has many deprecated modules that are just there for anyone to use it, which could be a potential problem. Well, just be sure don't use the bad ones. Now, current trends for embedded devices, there's one thing called lightweight cryptography, which is focused on restricted devices. So there's a new call for algorithms, well, it's been a while now, from NIST for creating lightweight cryptography that can be more friendly for devices that don't have this cryptographic acceleration unit and has small number of CPU cycles per second, or small amounts of RAM, small amounts of storage area. And in March of this year, actually, they just announced some 10 finalists, which are some cryptographic algorithms that once they decide which one is the best fit for embedded devices, well, that's probably where we're gonna go ahead for the encryption. But since this is an open contest, well, we still don't have a clear winner right now, because just a few months ago. But actually, I know a couple of these guys that they're good. Anyway, besides that, in the future, we have the quantum computers you have heard about, and they unfortunately they could break cryptography. But we are in the community trying to work with quantum safe cryptography, which essentially uses mathematical programs which are not fit for quantum computers yet. So that's the future challenge. And I would like to say that due to the increment of computer power of the embedded system and the IoT in general, actually there's no excuse for not applying cryptographic schemes to your devices, because they are fit enough for some basic cryptography. For instance, as I mentioned before, the ESP32 is a super scalar processor with 2 CPU cores, and also is a 7-bit super pipelined CPU processor, which it may be bad if you recall the Spectre and Meltdown attacks from the previous year. And they have quite nice clock frequency, and they're quite cheap. They're $5 each. Well, I mean, for an embedded device with this capability, $5. Well, it's fine. And of course, delivery will be an issue, but depends where you live on. But $5 is the cheapest price. So that's it. So these are the directions for the future of the embedded devices and the security and cryptography.